Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 34. Are you ready to move beyond flat files for your data in Python? Maybe you're not sure where to start with databases and SQL. This week on the show, David Amos returns with another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. We cover a Real Python article about managing data with SQLite and SQLAlchemy. David explores the intricacies of using the Modulo operator. We also cover several other articles and projects from the Python community, including how to shoot yourself in the foot with Python, exploring fractals on a cloud computer, the DMCA takedown request for YouTube DL, Python for feature film, an online multiplayer text-based game framework, and a sorting algorithms visualizer. This episode is brought to you by the Techmeme Ride Home podcast, Silicon Valley's favorite daily podcast. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, David. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot. Good to be back.
All right. So what have you brought us to start with here?
My first one this week is called How to Shoot Yourself in the Foot with Python Part 1 by Miguel Brito. It's sort of a fun and whimsical look at some of the things. I'm assuming these are things that have affected Miguel personally. Some of them may look familiar to listeners. Some of them looked familiar to me when I was first starting out with Python. And it just catalogs 5 different things that, you might run into that sort of make you stop and go, what in the world is going on here? And I'm just going to go through and list the 5 things, and won't go into all the details so that there's still something fun to read in the article. But he talks about implicit string concatenation, and this is one that maybe not so much of a gotcha, or maybe it depends on how it comes up, but it's something that for me, it was just the first time I saw it, I was like, wait a second, that's valid? Like that's real syntax? It looked kind of odd to me. So the premise here is that if you have 2 strings and you want to concatenate them, usually, the most basic way to do that would be to put a plus sign, right? Use the concatenation operator between those 2 strings.
Yeah.
And we concatenate them and you get a single string back with all the characters from those 2 strings. Well, you can remove that concatenation operator and just have 2 strings side by side with a space between them. And that will implicitly concatenate to a single string. So this works like if you want to split a long string up. It's a technique I actually have used some on my own, where you put a bunch of strings inside of parentheses, not like a tuple. You don't have commas between them, but you put an open parentheses in the first string and then hit enter. And on the next line, you put the second string and then hit enter after that and put another string and so on until you have your long string that you want split up and then close the parentheses. And that will just implicitly concatenate everything into a single string. So I guess it's something he ran into and just wasn't clear. Like, wait a second, like what's going on here? There's not even an operator. How is this working? So there's that implicit string concatenation. Something interesting that he found with the walrus operator, which was new in 3.8. So that is that you might expect, some people might expect it to work similarly to an assignment where like you can assign multiple values on the same line. So you have like a comma b equals 2 comma 3. And then when you inspect a, it's equal to 2 and the variable b is equal to 3. So there's something going on there called tuple unpacking, which is what works in that case. But you might say, can you do the same thing with the walrus operator? Like, could I do a comma b and then, colon equals 16 comma 19? And that gives potentially some unexpected results. So if you run it in the same session that you ran where you assigned a to 2 and b to 3, when you do this a comma b walrus operator 16 comma 19, you end up with a 3 tuple of 2 comma 16 comma 19. And it just looks like, wait a second, like what in the world just happened? How did I get this 3 tuple out of it? So he talks about why that that happens, and I'm not going to mention why. I'll leave that to those of you that want to read the article, and then some other weird things that could happen if you didn't have values already set there. So the moral of that story is, don't assume that an operator that looks like another one sort of behaves the same way in that case. The next gotcha he talks about is to be careful when using the plus equals, this augmented assignment operator with lists. And this one doesn't have so much to do with the operator itself as it is just the way that these operators work with different data types. So for example, if you have a list of integers and say 1, 2, 3, 4, and you make a copy, let's call that A, and you make a copy of that list and you do B equals A, and then you do A plus equals 5, 6. So you've got this list of numbers now at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That also affected B, because when you assigned A to B, what you did was assign a new name to the same list in memory. It's just pointing to the same list as before. So you can contrast this to the way that this augmented assignment works with, say, something like an integer. So if you have the variable A, you assign it the value 1, and you have set B equal to A. Then if you increment A plus equals 1, then A is equal to 2, but B is still equal to 1, because they're not. You get a new copy of that integer when you assign A to B, which doesn't happen with lists, because lists are mutable. The moral of that story is just to don't assume that similar looking operators or same looking operators work the same way on different data types.
Yeah.
That's another thing that can get you. Another gotcha is mutable defaults. This one I think a lot of people maybe have seen before if you've seen a lot of these kinds of gotchas. But that's if you have like a default argument in a function that takes the defaults to like a list. So if you don't pass anything into that parameter, then it just gets assigned a new list. This can cause problems, because that default argument is always pointing to that same list the first time it gets called.
Yeah.
Or really not even when it gets called. It's probably when it happens when it gets compiled to bytecode. It's creating that default argument, that empty list. And then every time you call that function, if you don't pass something to that parameter, then it's just going to use that same list over and over again. So there's some weird things that can happen there. And then another one is, he calls it chained operations gone wrong. This is when you have things like these like chained expressions, like 25 is greater than X is greater than and equal to 10. So you want to verify that a value is between, in some range. So what happens here is, if you're not careful with parentheses, or if you don't understand necessarily everything about what's inside of those parentheses, you can run into some funny issues. So he's got an example where you have some variable X, and say you do this, I'm not sure what value he's assigned to it here, but okay, X is equal to 10. So you have a variable X that's assigned a value 10, and you have this expression 20 equals X equals 0. No parentheses or anything. You look at this, you're like, well, clearly that's false, because 20 is not equal to X and X is not equal to 0. So that should be false. Now, if you put parentheses around the left side of that, so the 20 equals X, now you've got parentheses, 20 equals X, that part in parentheses, and then the result of that equals 0. That evaluates to true. And that might throw some people off, because what's happening there is you've got the 20 equals X is being evaluated to false, right?
False, yeah.
Is returning false. And then you're saying, is false equal to 0? And in Python, the Boolean true and false are subclasses of the int class, of the int data type. So true is 1 and false is 0. So false really is equal to 0. And you can verify that in the command line in the Python shell if you want. But by putting that parenthesis there, you actually you might not expect it to change the value, but it actually does change the return value. So when you're doing these kinds of comparisons, again, when I look at this, I don't think it's so much about the parentheses as much as it is just when you're doing these kinds of comparisons, it's good to know like what you're actually comparing, right? Like not just what the value is, and what type it is, but what type that might be subclassed from. Or so, having a full understanding.
Right. Or it's going to evaluate too.
And what it's going to, how it affects the evaluation and everything. So anyways, there's the 5 gotchas. It's labeled part 1. So my guess is there's going to be
expect more in the future.
Some more in the future. Yeah. And what I like about it is that, it's, Miguel's sort of being vulnerable here. He's saying, look, these are some weird things that I came across while I'm, learning Python and programming in Python. And this is, it made me stop and go, what in the world? And, I'm trying to explain it. He has some explanations in here. And I thought he did something interesting. So he has some explanations that some commenters pointed out as, hey, that's actually not the correct explanation for why that happens. And rather than, deleting that and updating it, he just crossed through it. So you can still see his old reasoning, and then says, thanks to so-and-so who kindly corrected me and everything. So it's sort of this living document he's put together that I assume, he's learning a lot about the way Python works by doing all this. So it's a really good example of why it's good to write these kinds of things down and document these parts of your journey. And, if you have it in you, be a little bit vulnerable and put it out there and let people correct you. And the internet can be harsh, but
yeah.
But he's, had a lot of, nice people that have just given him some sort of gentle criticism and haven't been like, oh, you're stupid or something like that. They're just, hey, actually, that's not the way it works. But, check this out. This is actually what's going on. So really cool article. Miguel, thanks for putting it out there. I enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, cool.
What do you got?
So my next one is a real Python article. This one's from Doug Farrell, who's a previous guest on the show, and he came on to talk about APIs. And Doug has a lot of background in creating APIs and dealing with SQLAlchemy. And so this is kind of a dive deeper into the area of SQL and SQLite. There's so many ways that I've heard that pronounced, SQLite or SQLite or SQLite. So I may interchange them. I'm sorry. It's another one of those words. I don't know how you like to pronounce it. But it's called Data Management with Python, SQLite, and SQLAlchemy. It starts off with the idea of, okay, you have data, and you're going to be working with potentially where a lot of people start, which is, kind of going back to last week's episode with Al Swagart talking about automating the boring stuff and doing stuff inside of Excel or doing stuff in sort of these other situations. When you have a flat file of data, CSV or what have you, there's certain advantages to that. There's certain ways that you kind of work with that kind of information. And probably the biggest advantage is there's sort of built-in things in Python for reading it. And then there's really popular libraries like things like pandas for working with it and manipulating that data and so forth. But as a storage medium, it's got a lot of kind of problems. It's very hard to update the data in it. Also, you potentially, if you're sharing your work with multiple people, it's not really a shared source. And so you're walking around with files or emailing files and potentially dealing with multiple versions of things. The records themselves are just individual rows, and then you're having to have tons and tons of columns if you're adding attributes about these things. And it kind of starts to feel like, well, maybe there should be a central thing like a database that can contain all of these items. And that's where this structure of one of the simplest databases that I've worked with is this, SQLite. Mm-hmm. And SQLite is a file, which is kind of nice. It's an individual file that can be hosted in a shared kind of thing, or it could be, something that's up on the web, an API endpoint or what have you. And what's nice about it is it doesn't require a whole lot of additional structural stuff about it. It's literally just this file with the extension .db. So he talks about, creating the structure. It's sort of a bit of a primer on SQL if you've never done anything with SQL. So you're learning some of the basic commands behind it. And I've probably mentioned this, I don't know, too many times that's my background, where I kind of got really, really back into programming. And so it was like, oh yeah, this is pretty neat. And then it kind of gets into this, they call them ERD, which are these relational diagrams that you kind of create to decide, okay, if I'm going to take this thing, in this example, it's a set of books, how do you decide how this data should be related to each other? In the case of a book, there's an author, but there's also a publisher. And so those things, one author could write multiple books, potentially, and a publisher might publish multiple books. And so there's also this relationship where then, okay, this author might work with multiple publishers and so forth. And so you kind of need to decide, well, how do you want to divide these things up and creating those tables? And so it goes into that. And I think it's really kind of neat to kind of just see that background if you've never delved into this area and thought about what's happening there. And so advantages there is that when you go to update things, you're updating a single place. You can update with a single command, and it's going to go and adjust all the records, which is really powerful. And then really the crux of the rest of the article dives into working with SQLAlchemy and this sort of nice conversion from not having to do everything inside of raw SQL statements, which is yet another language, but to be able to turn things into these Python objects, which kind of gets a little bit object-oriented kind of stuff where you're structuring things and you're kind of creating methods that these objects do and attributes that they can return. And then how this software connects to that and returns things back and forth. And it's a very powerful tool. And you've probably heard of it if you've seen, well, Doug has a whole series of articles about Flask and SQLAlchemy and this thing called Connection. And it's like, I don't know, 3 parts. I'm not even sure if...
Several parts, yeah. I don't know the exact number.
Yeah, it might even be 4 parts. Yeah. I think it's a great resource for you to dive in and learn a lot about it. By the end of it, he's diving into creating an actual, Flask sort of application with this. And then there is code and examples where it actually has an example of a REST API server. So you get to kind of check out that code and kind of play around with it and kind of like, going from like a very simple structure, literally has like, I don't know, maybe 20 books or something at most, to a very large application. In this case, it's like a music thing. And again, talking about relationships, the idea of like, artists and songs and things like that.
Yeah.
And then, the idea of querying, the idea of like, okay, how could I do this through Python to be able to group things, query things, order things, very, very common techniques that people need to do with data. So it's a neat deep dive. I have a couple qualms with it. I actually mentioned to Doug that I would have structured that ERD differently, and that's, we get into the nerdery of that kind of stuff. But to me, like, I feel like a book is the central relationship between the two individual keys. Like, I feel like, yes, an author can write multiple books, and even the same book could be published by multiple publishers, but it would be a different book in that case, a different record. And so it's a lot of structural kind of thinking you need to do to kind of dive into that stuff. And that's something where I've had to deal with a lot of that and kind of building little apps for small businesses or working with data like mortgages and and loans and things like that, and banking, and trying to find all the relationships between them. And so it's been interesting. So it was kind of fun in a way to dive into my background and like think about how this fits into these relationships here.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. My thought on that is, at some point, I feel like as an author, you have to draw the line on an example, and right. So like, and how much complexity do you want? Yeah,
totally.
But also, when I look at this article, it's not a short article. It's pretty in depth.
No, it's pretty healthy.
What I love about it is that this is like for the absolute beginner in a lot of ways. It's almost a 0 to hero kind of thing.
Yeah.
Where if you have no experience working with data in Python, or even really working with data in like any kind of like managed format database at all, this is going to take you all the way through that, and you're going to come away with a lot of really good understanding of how this actually works. And this would set you up to really, go explore even further and look at some intermediate articles on the topic. So
yeah, there's a lot of resources there too, which is good. A lot of links to extra stuff.
Yeah, well done, Doug.
When the New Yorker magazine asked Mark Zuckerberg how he gets his news, he said the one news source he definitely follows is Techmeme. Every day by 5 p.m., the Techmeme Ride Home has all the tech news you need. Listen to the one podcast anyone who's anyone in Silicon Valley listens to every single day. Search your podcast app now for Ride Home and subscribe to the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. So what do you got next?
Next on my list is, what do you think? A math article.
Math, hooray!
No, it's a fun one. It dives into some math, but it's really about creating these animations and creating them on like a cloud server, but just set on sort of a mathematical background. So the article is called Exploring Fractals on a Cloud Computer. And let's face it, if you're going to make an animation, fractals are some of the coolest animations you can make. They're just mesmerizing to look at. So this comes to us from Eric Mathis, who is a teacher. I don't know if he's a middle school or high school teacher, but I've heard him speak on. I think he's been a couple of times now on the Teaching Python podcast. But
okay,
he's got a really cool blog that he posts a bunch of different stuff on. This week it's this was a couple of weeks ago now, this article, but Exploring Fractals on a Cloud Computer. It also is a pretty hefty article, and just looking at the table of contents, there's sort of like three main sections. There's how to generate a fractal image, and then how to animate a fractal, and then how to use cloud servers to render your animations so they don't take like 10 hours on your local machine. And but he goes into a lot of depth in the actual math background, and using complex numbers and how you like generating these fractals and everything. And he starts out using matplotlib, and then later switches to using PIL or PIL, which is an image library. That way you're not like creating a plot first and then having to convert that plot into an image. You're just directly creating an image. It's a little bit more efficient in that sense. Then he talks about using argparse to create like a whole command line interface for all of this to actually generate your images, and then moving into generating sequences of images and then putting that into an animation file. And it really walks you through this whole process, and you start kind of at zero, and you end up with this really cool little CLI application that can make these animations. And then it gets into like, wow, okay, if you really want to have like lots of detail in your animation and like high resolution, then even with the best MacBook or best PC on the market with 32 cores and whatever 64 gigabytes of RAM, whatever you've got, like some insane amount, it's still probably going to take you like several hours to generate a really high definition, detailed animation. So what can you do to reduce that time? Well, you can use a cloud server that tap into, the powerful computing resources that they have there. He does mention, there's lots of different kinds of servers that are available. For this particular one, the hosting platform he uses is Linode, and he talks about how to set it all up and everything. And he also has some like pricing information there to kind of have an idea, like, if you really wanted to do this, like how much is it actually, because it's not going to be free. You might get some free time, I guess, at the beginning if you're like a brand new customer for some of these platforms, but past that, it's not going to be free. So he does talk into like, if you really want to do this, here's how much it's going to cost you like per hour for, different kinds of servers. But anyways, you end up with, like I said, this really cool little command line application and some really cool little animations. He's got some videos that he's put in the article of the different kinds of animations that you can create with this. So really fun stuff. And if you're into numbers and fractals and then also just want to get some practice with, using image libraries and using argparse and writing a CLI and getting some practice with like a cloud compute system, then it's a really good way to get some practice there.
Yeah, kind of an article into project kind of thing, which is great.
Yeah, exactly.
So my next thing is actually a Reddit thread. And I don't know, I feel like it's a little bit news, but it's also connected to open source and kind of where these things two meet. And it's about a tool called YouTube DL, which is a tool that you can use to, in this case, code-wise, it's helping you to download videos, which can fall into copyright types of issues depending on how you're using this tool. I personally have downloaded things from YouTube to be able to watch them later, like if I'm traveling and stuff like that. Like if it's a conference talk, something that's fairly long where I'm not going to be sequestered away, and it's open source and it's free for people to grab. That's a legitimate case, but a lot of people may use these things in different ways. And so what's happened is there's been a DMCA takedown request, and it's from the RIAA, which is the Recording Industry Association of America. And you might remember them from back in the Napster days and going after different services and so forth at the time. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with open source? Why would the record industry? Well, a lot of people may be using this tool for the ability to download the music from YouTube, which is, I guess, not uncommon. And there's different deals that YouTube has in place for paying the royalties. And so this would kind of go past it. Anyway, so there's a couple things kind of going on in here beyond the fair use things that I mentioned. I think one of the sticking points that may have gotten this team of people who've created the YouTube DL in trouble is that they have integration tests, unfortunately, that use copyrighted content as examples. And so when they're running these integration tests, it's actually going and grabbing specific files that are songs in these cases. And so maybe that might have, with that amount of traffic, might have created some of the stuff to cause issues for them. And then there's also in their documentation, they mention a particular band by name. And so that's not super great, but
yeah,
regardless, it's one of these things where people want to kind of point the finger at Microsoft, and I don't know if they can really be blamed in this particular case. I know of other takedowns that have happened before, GitHub was acquired. So this is something to kind of keep in mind. And, there's a bit of an uproar about it and people looking at ways to be able to get versions of the code or fork it and so forth. But it's interesting. And it's one of these things that, you need to be careful in your open source projects to not be sort of, I don't know, flagrant in the way that you're, using as examples. I think you were talking about, I guess if somebody's setting up a CI/CD setup here with something like this to make sure it works, then, again, it's going to hit these multiple files.
Right. It's an interesting situation because it's, there are tons of valid fair use applications of a tool like YouTube DL.
Yeah.
I guess, the reason we're talking about this on this podcast is YouTube DL is a Python application.
Yeah, library, yeah.
So, the issue with the RIAA is not a Python issue, but it's just something to highlight that when you, like you said, when you make an open source project, be careful with how you are using that. Now, yeah, I mean, don't mention copyrighted material in your or brand names in your documentation, and stay away from copyrighted material in your tests or anything like that if you have something similar to this. So I mean, there would be, my guess is there wasn't, I mean, I haven't looked at the code, but I gotta assume there wasn't a need to use that copyrighted material in those integration tests. They could have created some stupid little video on YouTube, or even just a video of a static image or something, right? That they have the rights to, and they could have done the test that way if they even needed that.
I guess there's the DRM protection, which they are in some cases circumventing too, which maybe that was part of the testing that was showing that could do that. So again, that kind of gets into a bit of a gray area, which again, we're not a legal podcast in any way. So.
Yeah, exactly. But I also feel like, this hurts. A lot of people rely on these kinds of tools that have valid fair use applications. And this is, throwing a wrench in their plan and in some people's jobs and livelihoods. And they need to be able to use tools like this to document things.
Right.
And that kind of stuff. So it's a weird situation. It'll be interesting to see how it evolves, because I could see some agreement being made where if they remove certain things, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not super familiar with all the discussions and everything going on behind all of this. But, you look at the tool itself, and to me, it's sort of like saying, you know what, here's a crowbar. Burglars can use crowbars to enter, people's property illegally. Therefore, you shouldn't sell, crowbars, or we shouldn't make crowbars anymore. And it's that's kind of stretching it, right? It's a tool that has a real application. So yeah, it's just interesting development, and I'm curious to see how it's all going to pan out. If they're actually going to it's going to die and go away, or what's going to happen here.
Yeah, I feel like it probably will split off into other versions, but who knows?
Yeah.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's titled Playing and Recording Sound in Python. The course is based on a Real Python article by Joska de Lange. And in the course, instructor Joe Totusco shows you how to use some of the most popular audio libraries to play and record sound using Python. By the end of the course, you'll know how to play MP3 and WAV files, as well as a range of other audio formats, how to play NumPy and Python arrays containing sound, how to record sound using Python, and then how to save the recordings or audio files in a range of different file formats. I think exploring how Python can work with audio is not only fun, but a great way to explore the creative side of Python. It also could help you add a new set of multimedia features to your projects. And like most of the video courses on RealPython, the course is broken into easily consumable sections and has code samples for the techniques shown. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com. So what do you got next?
The next thing I've got is another RealPython article by Jason van Schoonveld, or sorry, I need to ask him how to pronounce his name properly.
It's Schooneveld.
Schooneveld, thank you.
Yeah.
Called Python Modulo in Practice, how to use the modulo operator, or what you might call it the percent operator, but it's called the modulo in mathematics. So this is another very in-depth article on, one of these things that RealPython, we have a lot of these kinds of articles where you look at this sort of simple thing and you think, wow, this is a huge article on this thing that seems like it should be relatively simple. But when you dig into it, it's actually not. And there's a lot of really fantastic information in this article, because the modulo operator is something that you do use, maybe not all the time, or it's going to depend on what you're doing, but it has a lot of very common applications in programming. And he talks about some of these common applications, like checking if a number is even or odd. So I guess I should start, I was saying just what the modulo operator does is it takes two numbers, like 10 and say the number 3, and you do 10% sine 3, 10 mod 3, and it returns the remainder of dividing the value on the left, 10, by the value on the right, 3. So in this case, it would be 1, because if you divide 10 by 3, it goes into it 3 times with a remainder of 1.
Right.
So that's the modulo operator. He gets into, so you can use this, for example, to check whether or not a number is an integer is even or odd. So if you do something, if you take a number and look at it modulo 2, so you do some number %2, if it returns a value of 0, that means 2 goes into that number evenly with no remainder, so it must be an even number. But if you get a 1 back, then that number must be odd. So that's a common use. You can also use it to do like a cyclical iteration. So you want to like iterate over a loop multiple times. You can take an index that will kind of reset, like you just do it, take your index, mod some number like the length of the loop or something, and it'll just cycle over that loop cyclically. There are lots of applications of the modulo operator in programming, so it does come up from time to time. And there's some interesting things to note about it. So one of the most interesting things, and this is something that surprised me when I first saw it in Python, was how it works with negative numbers. So in mathematics, which is my background, where I kind of started with programming for mathematics research, but from a mathematical standpoint, usually when you look at a number modulo some other number, you look at the positive remainder.
Yeah.
In general, I mean, there are reasons you might look at like a negative remainder if it makes sense, but for the most part, we just assume that, because you can, what's the right way to describe it? You can have multiple quote unquote remainders that are like equivalent to each other. I'm not going to get into modular arithmetic and everything, but for the most part, a mathematician is going to say, if I want to know what you get from some number modulo some other, I want the positive answer. And if you, in a language like JavaScript, that's what you get. And that's what I expected from Python, but you don't. Python keeps the sign of what's called the divisor. So that's the number that's going to be on the right-hand side of the modulo operator. There's a reason for that has to do with how they're actually calculating the remainder. And there's an interesting article that I'm not sure that it's mentioned here, if it's linked in here, but there's a reason that they made this decision in Python and some other languages that has to do with timestamp calculations, and why keeping that negative sign actually makes more sense than returning the positive one. So it's an interesting design choice there, but it's something good to know about the way that this modulo operator works. You might get something that you don't expect when you use it with a negative divisor. However, the modulo operator works with floating point numbers, not just integers. And in that case, it works differently. Or I'm sorry, not the modulo operator, but a function in the math module called fmod. F stands for float or floating point mod. And it's recommended that you use fmod instead of the modulo operator when working with floating point numbers because of floating point imprecision. It handles that rounding better when you have to deal with these floating point numbers. But it doesn't work with negative divisors the same way that the modulo operator does, the percent sign. So that's an interesting thing that Jason points out in this article. And he talks about, there's a div mod function, and, there's all sorts of these like variations and everything. So there's lots of, really, really good information in here. If you ever have to use this or find yourself using variants of it, then this is stuff that you're going to want to know. And he talks about some more advanced applications, like how to determine if a number is prime, how to implement ciphers using modulo, and some advanced uses using like the decimal class, how to use the modulo operator with your own custom classes. So there's just a ton of really, it's a really complete look at this modulo operator, which at first glance you might think, what can you say about that? Just here's a few examples and here's how it works. And then here's a ton of information that if it weren't pointed out, you might never look up, and it might become one of those things you end up shooting yourself in the foot with, right? If you aren't aware of it. So yeah, just a really in-depth, thorough article, and a good read if you ever need to use the modulo operator. I suggest taking a glance at Jason's article.
Yeah, I know about the use in cryptography. Like I've been reviewing some courses that have been coming out recently about cryptography things, and that it's a common tool for that, which is neat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know about the negative numbers. I rarely use it for that, so that's interesting. The behavior is very different.
Yeah.
My next one is something I've been interested in ways of using Python in kind of creative and artistic ways that are a little more advanced. You guys probably get that from me. And it's called Python for Feature Film. And it's by, I hope I get his name right, Dhruv Govil. And his website is gfx.dev. And this is a professional working in the movie space, working on, I guess the term would be just visual effects, because it's a variety. He's worked on things that are, purely animation, something like Hotel Transylvania 2 to Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, into some of the most recent Spider-Man movies. And he uses a tool called Maya, which is a modeling software that allows you to create 3D models of everything from solid, like a car or characters and so forth. And you might say, well, where does Python fit into all this? Well, it can help not only with something that we've talked about before, of like dealing with files and assets and moving these things around in the whole sort of pipeline of everything. You can think of like these movies use so many images, and very often it's not like a single file, like just, it's just a movie file. No, they're actual individual frames, right? And then the frame is actually made up of tons of little separate images that are then going to be composited together. And so having automated tools for dealing with all that data, Python's a great resource for something like that. And you can think of command line tools for doing things like that. But inside of Maya, creating models, one of the examples that he shows, because he has a course on this, diving into using Python inside of Maya, and he shows like taking a smaller model, like something like a woven pattern of like, maybe it looks like something like a rattan or wicker or something like that. And it's just a little square of it, but then like taking that and then wrapping that in a 3D model around like a torus, like, something that looks like a tire or a tube or something like that, and then deforming it. And then that whole pattern is falling across it. And it's not a texture, it's actual true 3-dimensional, with all the edges and sides and so forth, or taking something like a chain. And so Python can help to do all the additional calculations that would have normally been done by hand or kind of hand replicating and so forth. So anything you can kind of think of like boring stuff that you would have to sit there and go through and automating, he's showing ways that you can do that. And I didn't know, it was used in this way. I mean, I've heard of Python being used in, music production for kind of algorithmic music or generative music, which is always kind of neat, or building plugins and things like that. And I've just recently saw you had a PyCoders thing about using it in Photoshop.
Yeah.
Which I think would be kind of cool. Probably link to that one too. But then, this goes even further, the idea of if you're creating, clothes for characters, like costuming the characters, to be able to put together this entire like 3-dimensional model of, say this character all completely costumed out, and then to have a second model that's just the body shape, and then apply all of that and have it transform all of that to instantly fit that other character, which would have normally taken tons of time. Some interesting stuff that's in the article is that he mentions that many of the processes that are mentioned about using in Python are still kind of tied to Python 2.7, which I guess is true in a lot of other industries, which you kind of, run into.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a need to convert them to Python 3 and further. I don't know, it's just very interesting. And then lots of video examples showing how these things are being used. If you're not familiar with like animation today, like the idea of rigging, which is a little bit like, puppetry or marionettes, but for actual animation, where you have these solid things where you can then give this to an animator, or you can think of it almost like creating models that are used in a video game, where you're able to control, the facial interactions, and it's deforming all the muscles and skin and so forth to follow along in the model. And it's really neat. I think of it in some ways like in video games, like if you're doing something like Pygame or what have you, that there's these additional things you can add to create gravity, or, create these kind of physical, physics kind of models of things. And this is the same kind of thing to work with, like how would something, deform or solids or have particles, help them save time and eventually, spend more time creating things that are more useful. So it's a neat article. I really dug it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of important to mention too that it's not a technical article. There's not
at all. Yeah,
a lot of code examples or anything here, and a lot of it is, he's got this course, which I assume is a paid course.
Yeah, it's a Udemy thing. Yeah,
that he's kind of pitching throughout the article, but it's not a very salesy article either. Like it's really just an overview of like, hey, did you know Python is used in like the feature film industry? And like, here's like all these different ways that it appears in this industry. It's a whole bunch of stuff that I just had no idea. I also had never really seen like the animation pipeline broken down like that before, just because I've never really investigated it, or I guess been interested in like being an animator or anything. So it was just kind of neat seeing like, oh, that's how they do all that stuff. Like that's kind of neat. But it's cool to know that Python plays a big role there. And at the end of the article, he mentions some exciting things that he thinks that are exciting. There's just lots of possibilities with Python and machine learning and computer vision to do things like helping tracking objects inside of a scene and everything. So
yeah,
it's just really fascinating. And it's an interesting look into an application of Python that is probably not something most people have on their minds. And if you're into film, this could be a way to meld your interest in Python with your interest in film and animation. So really cool stuff.
Yeah, I think about like the lighting that needs to happen in these types of things, that everyone in these 3D scenes to render it, there's all these individual like light sources that you have to control. And so if you wanted them all to move together, it normally would have been like a whole thing where you're having to like, okay, move light 1, move light 2, and so forth. But the idea of being able to get them to work together, the whole thing in animation has always been this idea of like, there was like a, back in the Walt Disney original days of hand drawing things out, is there would be a key animator and they would like animate a single frame, and then they'd go and create another one and say, okay, these are the ones here, and now hand it off to other people that do the tweening, the in-between frames. And, that's really powerful what computers can do for creating all those in-betweens for you now, of like, modifying. And I didn't even really think about the idea of like, oh yeah, you could apply machine learning in these situations and so forth. And, there's definitely lots of interesting ways to kind of grow this technology so it's kind of fun to think of ways that other industries are, automating what they're doing too. So
yeah, exactly.
So that gets us into projects. What's your project this week?
The project I've got this week is something I'd never heard of before, and it sort of took me back to like my beginnings in programming. So I started when I learned to program. I learned to program in BASIC on an old PC that it wasn't old at the time, but super old nowadays, but a PC that my parents got when I was in elementary school when they got it. One of the first things I did when I was learning to program in BASIC was to make these little like text adventure games.
Yeah.
So I came across this project called Evennia. It's not a new project. I guess it's been around for a while. I didn't look at the commit history, but there's some commits just on the repo that look like, almost a year ago, and it might even be older than that at this point. So, but it's a modern library for creating online multiplayer text games, which just immediately was like, oh, wow, that sounds really intriguing. That looks really cool. It looks like a pretty cool library to use. You just, it's a Python library. You code using Python modules. They get imported. It's like just like coding in Python like normal. So it looks like it's very low barrier to entry if you're already familiar with Python. So pretty cool stuff. I did not get a chance to play around with it, but it looks like there's some pretty cool things that people have come up with it. And it sounds like you've had some experience with it.
Yeah. The local user group here in Colorado Springs, PySprings, shout out to them.
Nice.
They brought this in one time before lockdown. It was like last, I guess, might have been just in February or something. And we set it up and got it running and had a central server. And then the different people inside the meetup were logging in and creating their, characters and so forth. And we could interact inside there. So, it's definitely multi-user, kind of this persistent kind of thing. And it comes with a nice little demo game that you could kind of start working with. And we were up and running within 40 minutes of everybody just kind of getting going. And then what we were looking forward to doing eventually, and I'm not sure how far they went with it, is, okay, well, how do you now make this our own game? And that's where you start to really dive into like, okay, the objects and scripts and creating the in-game dialogue and so forth. But it was fun. It was neat to see it standing up and kind of have your own ownership of a tool like this. So I had fun with it, and like I said, like you said, it's not a big barrier to entry. We were up and running with this real mix of different user levels of Python.
Yeah. And I mean, it looks like there's a lot of activity going on on this. There's been a lot of updates even since you used it, probably, I guess, six or so months ago now. So it's very active in development, and it just really caught my eye. I was like, that looks really cool. I want to try to do something there, because it just instantly took me back to like those little cave adventure games that I made, or space adventure games that were all text based when I was a kid. So yeah, it looks really fun. What do you got?
So my project is related to an article, a recent Real Python article that's being turned into a course that has to do with algorithms, in this case, sorting algorithms. And it's a sorting algorithms visualizer. And it allows you to see with Pygame how these things are sorting. And I'm not a computer science background type person, and so I didn't know all the different forms that people have thought of ways of sorting. And so it was very interesting for me to learn, okay, well, you could start with something very simple like a bubble sort, which is very, very time intensive depending on the layout of, what's happening in there, to merge sorting, to quick sort, and so forth. And this actually, what's nice about it is you can kind of hear like simple examples where somebody will show you like, oh, like 5 numbers, and then try to like animate like, okay, well, it would do this first and do that. Well, this can actually show you, whatever scale you want, but like in their examples, visually, they're showing like 100, say, random numbers, and it's sorting them, and then how that is happening visually. And it's using Pygame to do that, which I think is really cool. And I think it's a neat project that you could probably, like I think you mentioned earlier, as taking what's there, if you wanted to make it your own, I could see turning this into a CLI pretty quickly, or potentially turning it into, a command line interface kind of thing where you're putting in how many values do you want to sort, and then maybe you want to choose which algorithm and then what kind of delay you want. Or going inside the Pygame side of things and making the controls be more of a GUI kind of interactive thing. And so, I don't know, it's a neat project. I'm suggesting it to the guy who's creating the video course, Liam, that I think it might be kind of useful to show this as a form of animation that could kind of explain some of the things that are happening in there.
Yeah. I want to throw something in real quick, because since we're on the topic of sorting, that people need to see this because it's hilarious. So have you seen the XKCD comic on ineffective sorts?
No, I can imagine. No.
Okay. We'll have to post a link to it. Well, it's typical XKCD. It's, it's these like funny sorts, and he's got like the job interview quick sort, and like the code is like, okay, so you choose a pivot. That's the first line of code. Then divide the last in half. And then for each half, check to see if it's sorted. No, wait, it doesn't matter. Compare each element to the pivot. So like, it's just these funny sorts. But there is a Python project on GitHub, or at least on the PyPI, that was inspired by this, and it's called Stack Sort. And this is hilarious. So it just came to me while you were talking about this. I just want to throw this out there. So bonus, I guess, third project this week. What Stack Sort does is it has different kinds of sorts in it. So like the bubble sort, for example. But what the bubble sort function does is it doesn't have any particular implementation ready to go. What it does is it scrapes Stack Overflow to try to find a bubble sort implementation and then runs that. So you have no idea what. So if you go to the GitHub repo, there's like this disclaimer, like, do not actually, like, don't run this code on anything that actually matters. Like, it's you have no idea what's going to happen. You're running random code from the internet. But I thought that was just absolutely hilarious. That like, yeah, the whole thing is like, we're just gonna bubble sort. Okay, let me search quick sort for bubble sort Python and like find the solution that has like the highest number of votes, or I don't know how they pick it, and then we'll just run that and see what happens when we run it on your input. Good stuff. Yeah. So not the most efficient for any of these.
Yeah.
But good stuff.
Yeah, it was interesting, reviewing the course, and he's doing timing of these different things, and then comparing the actual implementation inside of Python, which is at the C sort of level. The timing is just
right. It's
just insanely changed. And so it's one of those things where like people say, oh, Python's slow. It's like, well, a lot of it's happening in C, and if you're using the optimized stuff. And so, yeah, it was intriguing to kind of watch those differences. And this is obviously slowed down too, because it's using, this as a way to sort of teach you what's happening.
Right. Exactly. It's a teaching tool, not this is back to the sorting visualizer. Yeah. It's a teaching tool and not an actual sorting
exactly.
library. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for bringing all this stuff again this week.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. See you later.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. I want to thank David Amos for coming on the show this week and bringing along all those great articles. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favorite player. And if you like the show, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.